Hello and welcome to Capitol Hill. I'm Nick Dole. In just over 2 hours, the Treasurer will get to his feet to deliver the budget. Wayne Swan's done it 5 times before, and despite his promise last year, he won't be delivering a surplus. The government says revenue's taken an unexpected $17 billion hit, but it's still committed to funding those big ticket items like school funding reform and a disability insurance scheme. And that means there'll have to be some major cuts beyond what we already know. Joining me to discuss the budget and what we might be able to expect is Labor's Stephen Jones and the Liberal Party's Alan Tudge. Welcome to you both.
Good to be with you.
Let's start off hearing from the Treasurer, Wayne Swan. He says instead of making projections over the usual 4 years, this year he'll be showing how the Gonski reforms and the NDIS can be funded over the next decade.
You know, you can't invest in education on a 4-year forward estimate cycle. You can't do that. You've got to put these investments in place for the long term. If you've got a permanent or severe disability, you don't have it for 4 years over the forward estimates. You have it for life.
If Wayne Swan's lines don't stack up from 1 year to the next, how could you possibly believe his claims about things that are going to last 10 years?
Stephen Jones, does Joe Hockey have a point there? He says, you know, Wayne Swan has made a number of mistakes when it comes to forecasts before, and this relates only to a matter of months. How can he really be trusted to give us a projection about how these big ticket items are going to be funded over the next decade?
Because we have mechanisms in place to fund them. Take the NDIS, the Disability Insurance Scheme. We will introduce legislation into Parliament tomorrow which will increase the Medicare levy from 1.5 to 2% to provide a hypothecated tax to fund that particular mechanism.
It only funds some of it, though.
To pay for that, and the further announcements will be made throughout the course of the evening by the Treasurer on how the balance will be paid. But can I go to the underlying point, and that is this. We have been through some of the most extraordinary times in world economic history over the last 2 years. Everybody, from the Reserve Bank, Treasury officials, large companies have had difficulties in looking out into the future and saying what's going to happen. We anticipated revenues would be bigger than they were from profit-based taxes. They haven't come in as we've expected, over $16 billion hit to forecasted revenue. We have to make adjustments to account for that. The important thing, however, is you don't send a shockwave through the economy by suddenly pulling back on the government sector. Make your savings where you can, but give priority to jobs, keeping businesses open.
We've just had the news in the last few minutes come through that tonight's budget will be forecasting a surplus in financial year 16-17. Given the sorts of problems that the Treasurer has had with forecasting before, do you think the electorate believes that that is a credible path back to surplus?
Well, the underlying strength of the economy is good. We've got, by international standards, unemployment at around about 5%, acknowledged by John Howard today, a good number. Our government debt, by international standards, is in a very comfortable position, and that's why all the major rating agencies give us a AAA credit rating. The underlying strength is good. We know there will be a turnaround. We know there'll be a turnaround, whether it's sometime next year or the year after. Things will bounce back to a more favourable position, and that's why, in this sense, it's probably easier to predict where we're going to be in 2014-15 than where we're going to end up in 2012-13.
Alan Tudge, the coalition's been calling on the government to come clean, as it says, and explain to people how it is going to fund these things over the long term. So do you welcome this promise from Wayne Swan that he'll be providing this long-term assurance?
In part, yes, but the key problem which Wayne Swan has and the Labor Party have is lack of credibility. Because last year they made so many promises in their budget which they frankly have not kept, with the most substantial one being that they would deliver a budget surplus this year come hell or high water. And they didn't say this just one time, they said this 500 times. And furthermore, Wayne Swan himself has said that it's almost impossible to make 10-year projections. And so I think what this is about is more spin rather than actual substance here.
But the coalition has asked for that assurance. The coalition wants those long-term projections. I mean,
and if those long-term projections are there, and if they include defence expenditure and health expenditure and other long-term expenditures, then we would welcome that. But frankly, you can't trust what the government says anymore, because they'll promise one thing tonight, but they'll deliver something completely different. want. That's been their track record, and so you can't trust them what they'll say tonight.
Tony Abbott's been saying that the government needs to track a credible path back to surplus. Do you think 16-17, financial year 16-17, is an acceptable time to return to surplus?
Well, we haven't seen the books. We don't know the full state of the accounts to be able to make our decision, and we'll be making our decision from the coalition's perspective once we have seen the full accounts. But just let me make this point again. Last year, the government said they would deliver a surplus this year. They've had an 8% increase in revenues this year, an 8% increase. So to Stephen's
revenue's
point,
been nowhere near what they projected.
But last year they projected a 12% increase in revenue this year. An heroic forecast, which we said at the time was heroic. We have not had such an increase of 12% for decades. So an 8% increase is still a huge increase in revenues for this year. But what they did was they spent the money as if they were going to win Tats Lotto. Then all of a sudden they say, geez, we didn't win Tats Lotto. And what do you know? We're in deficit. That's what's occurred this year.
Right, Stephen Jones, let's talk about some of the things that will need to be cut to pay for these big ticket items, things like Gonski and the NDIS. I know you haven't had any chance to catch up with the news, but in the last 5 minutes it has been confirmed to the ABC that the baby bonus will be abolished, but there will be increases to family tax benefit A. It will be a big saving for the government, though. Are you comfortable with taking some money from families to pay for things like education and disability reform?
What I'm not comfortable is preempting what the Treasurer is going to get up in less than 2 hours and deliver not only to the Parliament, to the nation. I haven't heard the reports that you're referring to or any confirmation of them. All of that will be revealed by the Treasurer at 7:30 when he stands up in Parliament tonight.
Alan Tudge?
Well, I think if you've trashed the budget, cuts have to be made, and cuts are never pleasant, and that's what we're likely to see tonight.
Okay, what about something that is confirmed? We had the Foreign Minister confirming that once again the commitment to get foreign aid to 0.5% of gross national income will be deferred. Are you comfortable with that?
Look, I find it very difficult to say in any year when there's a $500 million increase in foreign aid and when it's going up by 9.6% that's bad news in terms of our humanitarian obligations. We're doing very well as far as international aid commitments go. We are certainly in the top 5 in the world. I think we've got a very proud record, and I'd be happy to stand up and say that anywhere.
Nick, this is another broken promise. I mean, this just wasn't an ordinary commitment from Labor. It was an eyeball-to-eyeball guarantee. That's what they said last year. So it's another broken promise by the government.
Can I just take Alan up on this issue? I
mean,
we've heard a chorus of bagging and opposition, but what we haven't heard, your boss is going to get an opportunity to stand up on Thursday and say, this is what I'll do. I'll put a positive alternative.
Stephen raises a point. You've criticised this cut. Would you guarantee that you'd restore that to boost foreign aid?
Well, we can't make any guarantees at this stage until we've seen the accounts.
But how
You've
can
been
you
saying that for
expect
2.5
But
years.
Nick, we don't know the set of accounts, and the accounts are changing weekly, because 2 or 3 weeks ago, Stephen, your colleague said we only had a $7 billion shortfall in revenue. Then the week later it was $12 billion. Then the week later it was $17 billion. Who knows what the figure will be tonight? And still, until we can see the baseline figures, we cannot lock in our commitments.
But how do you expect people to trust you if they're not going to be able to find out until 10 or 12 days into the election campaign?
Well,
I mean, you've got to give us some detail, surely.
Well, to start with, Nick, we've got a very good track record of properly managing a budget and properly running surpluses. That was our track record in government.
And secondly,
well before the election, we will outline what our commitments will be.
Okay, well, let's talk about another major saving that we already know about, $2.3 billion cut to the tertiary education sector. It'll help pay for the school education reforms, but it's continuing to outrage students and their lecturers.
And we today as a union call on all MPs, including many of those Labor Party backbenchers who've invited us into their offices to tell us how important higher education is, to actually find a spine, to actually support higher education, not to walk away from it and not to wound higher education further.
Stephen, you represent a good chunk of the Illawarra. Of course, the University of Wollongong's a huge employer down there. Are you comfortable taking money from tertiary education to put it into school funding?
Look, I'd always like to see a circumstance where we don't have to do that, but there is an underlying point here. Under Labor, there has been a massive increase in funding to the university sector. In my own university alone, over $120 million worth of capital works have gone in there under a Labor
But
government. Funding will go up next year as well.
The demand is much higher though too.
Funding will go up.
Students.
Funding will go up to the university of my electorate and every other university around the country. It will increase next year, just not by as much as they would like us to be increasing that funding.
Okay, Alan Tudge, you're on the Education Committee and you're looking into the future of tertiary education. Again, the coalition's criticised these cuts, but you won't say whether or not you'll actually restore them. In fact, you've hinted you'll probably bank them.
Well, again, we can't make our full financial commitments until we know what the state of the books are, and the books are moving weekly, Nick. That's the bottom line. Do we want to see those cuts? Absolutely not. I'm an advocate for more funding towards education, have been for a long time. But if the budget is as bad as what we think it is, then cuts need to be made, and that's what the government's doing.
And you'll keep them?
Well, we haven't made any commitments yet in relation to them.
Okay, Stephen Jones, the Treasurer says this will be a Labor budget. What about those, some of your I guess, your key base, some of those who are doing it tough, those on welfare who've been crying out for an increase to the dole? Are you disappointed that it doesn't look like there'll be any money in terms of the actual payments to them?
In this area, I've been pushing for two reforms. One for reform to the way we're dealing, a better deal for single mums on the single mum pension. Very pleased to see that we've seen an increase in the income-free threshold for single mums, single parents. Means an extra $60 a fortnight when added to what we're doing in relation to the education supplement, taking that over to single mums on New Start, a significant increase for there. The long-term objective is twofold. Getting more job opportunities for these people, always better that they're in a job than on a benefit. But secondly, closing the gap that has emerged between pensions and the unemployment benefit. Too far, too great. We need to have a plan to fix that.
Alan Tudge, the opposition's talked about ending the age of entitlement. Where would you like to see some of the savings tonight? And I mean, if you've talked about that, doesn't that mean you really should be backing the government when it comes to things like scrapping the baby bonus?
Well, we've already announced a number of savings which we will make. For example, the school kids payments we will scrap. We will, through natural attrition, prune the public service by 12,000 people. We will scrap the Energy Finance Corporation, which will save $10 billion. We'll have a
That's
better
not
NBN.
middle-class welfare.
We'll have a better NBN. But these are all savings which we have announced, and we'll announce further savings before the election.
Stephen Jones, just finally, today Tony Windsor said that he thinks this will be Wayne Swan's final budget. Do you agree?
Oh, look, I think we've got a tough election ahead of us. There's absolutely no doubt about that. But tonight, and the budget's about doing the right thing by the economy. The opposition's prescription would see us back in recession and see thousands of people thrown out of work. That's why the underlying emphasis in this budget, keeping businesses alive, keeping people in jobs, and that's the right thing to do.
And that is where we will have to leave it. Alan Tudge and Stephen Jones, thanks very much for your time this evening.
Good to be with you.